Hey everybody, and welcome to the next edition of the Soccer Fitness Goals video blog. Today on the blog we're going to be discussing monitoring training load. I'll explain a little bit about why it's so important, and then I'll provide you with some simple tools that you can use to try to monitor your training load, whether you're a soccer player, parent, or coach. So monitoring training load can be done using any tool that allows you to quantify or measure how intense any particular training session or game was. Now, why is this so important for soccer? Simply put, if you don't measure and quantify how hard you're working as a player, or if you're a coach and you don't measure or quantify how hard your players are working or how intense they found a training session or game, then any subsequent training that you've planned or are going to do is going to be planned completely based on guesswork and your own subjective opinions of how intense you thought the training was. And this is a big problem, and I think it's also something which is commonly overlooked by soccer players and soccer coaches in Canada. So if you're lucky enough to get to work or to get to play in a professional or a national team environment, then you'll probably have access to technology like heart rate monitors and GPS, which makes monitoring of training, if not necessarily easier, it actually allows you to get and collect a lot of data that helps you to monitor and to measure and quantify how hard players are working. But for the great majority of soccer players that are at the amateur level, typically this technology is not available. But that's not really a problem, because there is a simple tool, and we will attach a PDF document of it, and we'll talk about it, but a simple tool that any player or coach can use to try to quantify and measure how intense training or games are. And that tool is called the Rating of Perceived Exertion, or RPE. And there's been a lot of research over several decades actually that has validated the RPE and even shown that when players use it, that the data that you can get out of it in terms of how intense a training session or game was is actually just as accurate as a heart rate measurement. So that being said, even in the amateur environment where using more expensive or more advanced technology isn't always practical or realistic, if you do use RPE, you can get an accurate and reliable measurement which will allow you to quantify how intense a training session or a game was. So the Rating of Perceived Exertion, or RPE, is basically just a scale that is used to measure how intense a training session or game is. And there's a few different ones that are used, but the one that I like the best is made by a scientist called Borg, and it's a 0 to 10 scale, with 0 being equivalent to rest and 10 being equivalent to maximal exercise. And the reason that I like that, especially for use with younger amateur players, is that 0 to 10 is something that's easy for anyone to understand. If you think of, let's say, what the number 5 out of 10 represents, it's pretty easy to understand that 5 out of 10 would represent 50% intensity, and 7 out of 10 would represent 70% intensity, and so on. So this is something that, as opposed to some of the other scales that have different numbers and progressions through the scale, the 0 to 10 scale is really easy and simple to use. If you're a soccer player, all you need to do is keep that scale with you and have a look at it, and then keep a journal every day that you have a training session or game and record that number. If you're a coach, all you need to do to record it for your team would be to make a spreadsheet where every column in the sheet has a day of the week or a day that you have a training session or game, and every row has the players' names. Once you've collected all of this data, then you can start to look at things like measuring the average intensity or the average RPE for a particular session across your team. Another thing you might want to look at is, once you know the average, maybe there are certain players that you assess that were either significantly higher or significantly lower than the average. For example, you may have run a training session where the average RPE was 6 out of 10, but you had a group of 3 players who rated it as a 9 out of 10. It's possible in this case that those players worked a lot harder than the others. It's also possible that those players are not as fit as the others, and so they just found the session harder, and so on. But again, without taking the time to actually physically go out and monitor the intensity, then that kind of information is completely unavailable to you. And again, you would be simply guessing as to how intense your players actually found the training exercises and the games that you participated in. So, in my opinion, any coach who's working with competitive soccer players must make monitoring of the intensity or training load of training sessions and games using a tool like the Rating of Perceived Exertion a mandatory part of the work that they do. If not, what you're basically doing as a coach is you're just using your own guesswork or your own subjective opinion when you're trying to determine how hard any player worked in a particular training session or game. And you're also just guessing when you're trying to plan the load and intensity of future training sessions that you're going to do. And to me, that's not acceptable for a coach in a high performance or competitive environment. So what we'll do next week in the blog is we'll build on this topic a little bit, and we'll actually discuss what's coming up for coaches and players in Canada, which is the start of the preseason training period. So we'll discuss how intense training sessions should be during this time period, and what types of data in terms of the monitoring and the RPE, what numbers coaches and players should be looking for in terms of the intensity that they're going to be working at during training and games in the preseason. So that's all for this week's edition of the Soccer Fitness Goals video blog. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We'll see you next week, and until then, keep reaching your soccer fitness goals.